Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to the Lunchbox Lecture Series at Beloit College. I'm Chris Fink, a professor of English. Welcome you all here. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. I'd also like to thank Carolyn Robinson, who's the Wizard of Oz, making all this possible. And I'd like to thank her for the opportunity to make dubious claims, not just to my students who sometimes don't know better, but to the wider world. So today my talk is called How to Talk Midwestern, a talk about a class. And this talk is going to be about a new class that I'm teaching this semester at Beloit College, English 310, which is a cross list with Environmental Studies 280, How to Talk Midwestern. And I want to say that I use talk as a euphemism for expression. So it's not about Midwestern idioms and colloquialism so much as about Midwestern literature and the theme of Midwestern literature. And I've been looking for 2 years for a great opportunity to use this photograph, which is one of my favorites. I wanted to use this as my book cover. Actually, I had a book of Midwestern fiction come out 2 years ago called Farmer and Farmer's Almanac. I wanted this cover because it shows the dairy farmer in his desperation to connect with the outside world, making this radio, which looks like a spaceship. And having worked in dairy farms, I know that the main thing that goes on in there is that farmers try to get the radio to work. So I wanted to use this as my cover. My publisher wanted to use a half-naked farm lad, strapping farm lad, and we ended up somewhere in between. I was interested in thematic integrity, and he was interested in sales. So here's the cover slide for my talk. And my class, English 310, which is a capstone in English, cross-listed with Environmental Studies 280. This is a description of the class. You are Midwesterners. Even if you don't hail from this part of the country, you've now spent a good deal of your young adult lives here. After 3 or 4 years at Beloit College, you have a distinct notion of what it means to be a Beloiter. This capstone class is designed to help you think creatively and critically about what it means to be a Midwesterner. What, in fact, is the Midwest? Are its citizens and its art somehow recognizable as Midwestern? This course will interrogate the concept of a Midwestern aesthetic or sensibility by examining its literature. I want to say that this is a thesis-seeking class. That is, I'm going into the class asking the question, what are the qualities of Midwestern literature? And the class is answering those questions. The class came to be for a couple of reasons. One is my own Midwestern roots and my own writing about the Midwest, but also my idea that students come to these colleges like Beloit College from all over the country and all over the world sometimes, not having any idea about the landscape they're arriving to. I went to Colorado College on an Associated Colleges of the Midwest grant last year. Looks very similar to Beloit College, some colleges in the East Coast. The same trees are growing there. Same landscaping. At Colorado College, they have what's called the Sense of Place initiative, where they help students understand the climate and landscape they're entering. And I thought at Beloit College, we need to do a better job also of helping students to understand the culture and the landscape they're entering. We bring them here and then we say, go study abroad and then graduate. But how do we prepare them to live in the Midwest while they're here? There are 2 epigraphs for the course. The one first comes from the poet Theodore Rutke, who says, "We have failed to live up to our geography." And the second comes from Thoreau, who says, "The man who is often thinking it is better to be somewhere else than where he is excommunicates himself." And no one who's from the Midwest or who lives here can honestly say they haven't spent a good deal of their lives wishing or thinking it would be better to be somewhere else. So this class I'm offering kind of as an added antidote to that. And here are the required texts. I brought them for you to look at. I'll talk more about each one of these individually as I go through my talk. I do want to say that one of the challenges of creating a syllabus and a book list for a course on Midwestern literature is that you don't want to end up with all books by white guys from small towns. That was one of the challenges. Okay, and I give you 2 of the many course goals that sort of are related to the talk I'm giving. One course goal, to interrogate the 2 questions. 1, is there a distinct Midwestness, and how is it related in art? How is it revealed in art, excuse me? And 2, to ask and answer through creative expression these 2 questions. Who am I, and what is my relationship to this place? So English 310 is a hybrid class. It's a capstone literature and creative writing class. So a good deal of what the students do in the class is create their own Midwestern works of literature. And I have two poems that I use to frame the discussion of Midwestern literature, the Midwest aesthetic, and I'm going to read them to you. And the first one comes from Kevin Young, who was our Mackey Chair in poetry here 2 years ago. He read this very poem in this very room 2 years ago. He's originally from Kansas. He has a great epigraph to this poem that I would have liked to steal from my class, but I was already using the poem. It comes from Bob Dylan. He says, "The country I come from is called the Midwest." And the poem goes like this. I want to be doused in cheese and fried. I want to wander the aisles, my heart's supermarket, stocked high as cholesterol. I want to die wearing a sweatsuit. I want to live forever in a Christmas sweater, a teddy bear nursing off the front. I want to write a check in the express lane. I want to scrape my driveway clean myself early before anyone's awake. That'll put them to shame. I want to see what the sun sees. I want to see what the sun sees before it tells the snow to go. I want to be the only black person I know. I want to throw out my back and not complain about it. I want to drive 2 blocks. Why walk? I want love and stuff. I want to cut my sutures myself. I want to jog down to the river and make it my bed. I want to walk its muddy banks and make me a withdrawal. I tried jumping in, found it frozen. I'll go home, I guess, to my room where the moon changes and shines like television. So I presented this poem in a way as a Midwest for consumption. That is, Kevin Young, born in the Midwest, but had to have an outsider's view to write this poem because you can't really live in the Midwest and stay here your whole life and have an idea of what it means, what this means. So this is a Midwest for consumption. Many of the popular archetypes and stereotypes of the Midwest are explored in this poem. Midwestern slowness, whiteness, stubbornness, self-reliance, our overabundance, and finally our sense of isolation from our communities in our rooms with our televisions on. Okay, another Western poem which I use is, in a way, as a counterpoint to the Kevin Young poem and as a way to frame the class comes from, this is quite a famous poem by James Wright, who's originally from Ohio. This poem is called Lying in a Hammock at William Duffy's Farm in Pine Island, Minnesota. It goes like this. Over my head, I see the bronze butterfly asleep on the black trunk, blowing like a leaf in green shadow. Down the ravine, behind the empty house, the cowbells follow one another into the distances of the afternoon. To my right, in a field of sunlight, between 2 pines, the droppings of last year's horses blaze up into golden stones. I lean back as the evening darkens and comes on. A chicken hawk floats over, looking for a home. I have wasted my life. So I could spend my whole talk talking about just the tone in that last line, which is terrific. But this one I presented not as Midwest for consumption, but Midwest being, finding the beauty in the mundane, which is one of the themes that arose in this class, contentedness, lying in his hammock, a lack of ambition. Get up out of your hammock and go to the coast if you want to be somebody, right? Go to the East Coast or the West Coast. But this poem presents a kind of contentedness in being in the Midwest. And also, at least in my reading of the last line, there's a kind of a smug satisfaction in the last line. I've wasted my life, and I wouldn't have it any other way. All right? So these are the poems I use to sort of begin our discussion of Midwestern literature, a Midwestern aesthetic. And then we go into the books that I use. The first one is I use for the class is Scott Russell Sanders' Staying Put, Making a Home in a Restless World. Scott Russell Sanders was a Mackey Chair at Beloit College twice, one of the preeminent writers of creative nonfiction and conservation literature. This is art with a message. Okay, so he's writing about the Midwest, but he has strong opinions about how we should live, especially in this age of climate change and potential global calamity. So for this, I make for my class what I call Fink notes, which aren't exactly Cliff notes or Spark notes. These are sort of my own readings of the main points of these texts that we do. And of course, these are just personal, and the students can add or subtract. I'll give you a few of my Fink notes for the Sanders book. One, Sanders writes, "We have not been adequate to this earth." And remember the Rutke epigraph that I read earlier. In fact, he says, "We are living in the midst of a Holocaust." That's his words. It's time to change. Two, the dominant mythology in America is that of rootlessness and questing. That may have something to do with one. I'm, Scott Russell Sanders, making an argument for staying put. The likeliest path to ultimate ground leads through my local ground. Three, local knowledge is the grounding for global knowledge. By staying put, people might learn about the environment and might start to care, and some change might come to one. Four, there are no privileged locations. All there is to see can be seen from anywhere in the universe if you know how to look. If people learn how to look, some change might come to one. Five, because your relationship to the earth is physical, body and land are one flesh, you learn how to look through your senses. If you do so, some change might come to one. Six, people who root themselves in places are likelier to know and care for those places than are people who root themselves in ideas. Rooting ourselves in place is a way to change one, and one is we have not been adequate to the earth. We are living in the midst of a Holocaust. And finally, quoting Aldo Leopold, he writes, "The problem is how to bring about a striving for harmony with land among a people, many of whom have forgotten there is such a thing as land, among whom education and culture have become almost synonymous with landlessness." And one question we may want to talk about after this talk is whether or not a Beloit College education is synonymous with landlessness. Okay, so that was the first book of nonfiction, and then I moved to fiction. I used a collection of short stories, or a novel and stories by Sherwood Anderson. This is one of the quintessential works of Midwestern literature. And it focuses on the psychology of common people in everyday lives, which was new at the time in 1919. And this is definitely not art with a message in the same way that Sanders was. And from this book, we began our discussion of two of the main themes that arose in the class. One is the centrifugal force in Midwestern literature. That is, the writer or hero departs the small town, in this case, Winesburg, Ohio. And if you think of our Midwestern writers, two big names that come to mind might be Hemingway and Fitzgerald. There are others who left the Midwest and, after very early work, never came back to it, either in their work or physically. So this seems like a dominant theme. When you think about the Midwest, this is a place to leave. Don't come back to. The centrifugal force is the Latin definition of that is center fleeing, leave the center. Okay, and George Willard is the protagonist in this book. Gets many pieces of advice from the citizens of Winesburg, Ohio, who feel like they can't express themselves, but they feel like the young writer might be able to express something for them. And his father and other businessmen in town say, "Stay awake, pay attention, concentrate." And the countervailing advice he gets from his teachers and mentors and his mother, "Go to sleep, dream, forget everything you've learned." And so George Willard, the young reporter who works for the Winesburg Eagle, has to decide what advice to take. The book takes place over a couple of months before George Willard's departure from Winesburg to the city, the great city of Cleveland. And I gave you the very last passage in the book in which George Willard gets on the train to leave. And the last passage goes like this: "The young man's mind was carried away by his growing passion for dreams. One looking at him would not have thought him particularly sharp. With the recollection of little things occupying George Willard's mind, he closed his eyes and leaned back in the train car seat. He stayed that way for a long time, and when he aroused himself again, and again looked out the car window. The town of Winesburg had disappeared, and his life there had become but a background on which to paint the dreams of his manhood. So George Willard takes the advice to dream, to go to sleep, to forget everything he knew, and he's leaving the Midwest. And the Midwest is a nice place to leave if you're looking for a background on which to paint the dreams of your manhood or your personhood because of its flatness. It's like a blank sheet of paper or a blank canvas, as it were. One of the other Midwestern themes that came up in the class comes up here, the idea that being smart is not a good thing. You can be too smart for your own good. I don't think that much on the coasts, perhaps, but in the Midwest and Midwestern literature. So George Willard's mother says, don't become one of those smart ones. Then there's a sort of countervailing force that we found was arising in these books, and I call this the centripetal force, the force that pulls people back. And if you'd asked me before I taught the class, I would have thought that the centrifugal force, the sort of fleeing the center, was dominant in Midwestern literature. It turns out that that's not the case, that most of the books, all the other books we read, in fact, were about writers who had left the Midwest and then came home physically and lived physically in the Midwest, but also wrote about the Midwest. These include Aldo Leopold, John Porcellino, Kimberly Blazer, Scott Russell Sanders, Lorraine Niedecker, and me. Okay, some recurring themes. This slide doesn't come up very well. I'll give you a couple things. One of the things we did in class is after we read every couple books, I'd have students write on the board, okay, what have we learned about Midwestern literature? What are the new themes that have arisen? Finding beauty in the mundane. Simplicity does not equal simplistic. Unspoken does not equal uncommunicated. Rural versus urban. Understatement as a rule. And then the dominance of the weather and water in Midwestern literature. So we did this a few times throughout the semester. Hard work and labor, wistfulness versus weariness, the inability to communicate, isolation, anxiousness, the yearning to be somewhere other than the Midwest. These were themes that arose in the books. Okay, after reading Winesburg, Ohio, we read the work of local Wisconsin poet Lorraine Niedecker, who was a Beloit College student from 1920 to 1922, and she grew up in nearby Fort Atkinson, and she has often been compared to Emily Dickinson because she lived a sort of life of isolation on Black Hawk Island near Fort Atkinson. But in fact, she had spent early in her years, she made a brief year-long sojourn to New York, so she also sort of had the centrifugal and the centripetal force that brought her home, but she spent her life, career working here in Wisconsin, and wrote some of the most avant-garde and well-known poetry of our century. And I include for you two of her poems. Often in her early work, she doesn't title the poems. These are very minimalistic poems in the style of William Carlos Williams. They're called objectivist poems. This poem goes like this. People, people, 10 dead ducks' feathers on beer can litter. Winter will change all that. So unlike Scott Russell Sanders and Aldo Leopold, who are sort of making a call for action for change in relation to our behavior toward the environment, Niedecker has more of a notion that nature takes care of itself, washes itself clean, covers human degradation. I included one more just for the season. This is called Easter. A robin stood by my porch and side-eyed raised up a worm. Okay, so there's a Midwestern resurrection for us, something any of us have seen multiple times. So it's not the quality of what you see, but it's the quality of the mind seeing it. That's the message that comes through in Scott Russell Sanders and in Aldo Leopold and in Lorraine Niedecker. It's the quality of one's perception when we're looking at a landscape that often doesn't have vibrant colors. And okay. The next poet we read is Kimberly Blazer, who is now Wisconsin's Poet Laureate. Kimberly Blazer is a poet of Anishinaabe descent. She grew up on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. In this book, Absentee Indians, the focus is on absenteeism in how Native Americans like her, sort of growing up on the reservation, sometimes question the older relatives who come home from cities and question whether or not they're real Indians, because they spend just weekends or perhaps summers on the reservation. And then later in life, Professor Blazer herself, having left the reservation, earned a PhD, and working as a professor and a poet, comes back herself in these annual migrations to the reservation and wondering if she is not herself an absentee Indian. It was fascinating to look at this book, two works, Midwestern Native American writers whose ancestry obviously predates the term of Midwest, which is a European construction, so before all the lines were on the map. And then, of course, Sand County Almanac, many of you know, important seminal work of environmental conservation written by Aldo Leopold, who went to the Southwest to work as a forester and learned many of his ideas there, but then came back to the University of Wisconsin and bought a farm near the university, near Madison and Baraboo, that he helped to restore. This work was published in 1949 after his death. Some of the main ideas here, I focused on perception, or I'll focus on perception now because this is a creative writing class and this is what we do. First of all, he establishes himself in the minority like Scott Russell Sanders. Scott Russell Sanders says the minority, or the majority movement is this sort of rootlessness and questing, and I'm giving you a counterbalance to that. Leopold says there are some who can live without wild things. That's most of the population. And some who cannot. I'm one who cannot, Leopold says. This is a book for those people. He writes, our interactions with the natural world depend not on the quality of what we see, but the quality of the mental eye with which we see it. Think back to that Niederker poem about the robin raising a worm, something we've all seen in the Midwest. The weeds in a city lot, he writes, convey the same lesson as the redwoods. He writes also, the outstanding characteristic of perception is that it entails no consumption and no dilution of any resource. And finally, only those who can see the pageant of evolution can be expected to value its theater. And notice his humanistic metaphors here in the last one. This is his approach to the book. You need humanistic values to talk about scientific principles so you can communicate it. And in a way, this is a justification for my class. He sees evolution as a pageant and being in nature as theater. Okay, closing in on the end here, the next book we read was Map of My Heart by John Porcellino, who is a comic artist. He writes autobiographical comics. And he lives in Beloit, and I brought him to my class. I was looking for another book to use in my class, and I found a book of his in which he wrote about the bridges of South Beloit. And I thought, this is a perfect guy for my class. This book is A Map of My Heart. He's from the northern Illinois, and this is his home region, even though he spent many years away from the Midwest. I had my students construct maps of their own hearts in the class. And the book is about sort of centeredness and well-being in the place in which one lives. And thinking back to Lorene Niedeker, there's a theme that runs through the class with this idea. I'll give you one of his comics. It's called Busy Bee. Busy bee, being a bee. Busy, biz, is being, being. So really nice to teach this book right after teaching Lorene Niedeker, because you see the Eastern influence in both of those and the concision of the language and striving for contentedness in place, which I think is part of the class. Okay, final thoughts. Midwestern literature, we've discovered, is not flat or plain. In fact, Midwestern literature is avant-garde. In 310, we read groundbreaking short fiction, Sherwood Anderson, poetry, Lorene Niedeker, Native American literature, Blazer and Erdrich, and a seminal work of environmental conservation by Aldo Leopold, as well as one of the first practitioners of the form of the autobiographical comic. All these were from and about the Midwest. And I'll close with a couple pictures of my good-looking students. This is my students on a field trip from last week to Lorene Niedeker's cabin at Black Hawk Island on the Rock River. We're reading her poetry right outside of the cabin that she wrote her poetry in the mid-20th century. Here we are on the Lake Koshkonong, where Rock River flows into Lake Koshkonong. And finally, at the Poetry Wall in Fort Atkinson, where they've created a mural of one of the lyrics from Lorraine Niedeker's poetry. And I will stop there and take any questions you have. Thank you. Questions or thoughts, criticisms? What did I miss? Yes?
I wonder how much your approach to what is Midwestern isn't just a question of where, but when. Thinking a little bit about how much of our attention is sort of anchored, I think, very much in the 20th century.
Yes. Yeah.
Did that come up at all, sort of temporally locating the place?
It's a great question. I thought about this with constructing my book list. So this is a very much a 20th century literature course. And I think in part because that's my area of expertise, because of what I wanted the students to be writing. I used the novels that I used were sort of novels and stories. So obviously students can construct a novel in a semester. So I wanted to give them materials that they could emulate. But you're right that it's very much a 20th century construction. The books that I chose. Do you have a recommendation of an earlier text I might have used?
I think that's an interesting point. It's hard to go into very far in the 19th century.
Yeah.
I still feel like it's something that is
Yeah.
consciously about
Mm-hmm.
the Midwest.
Yeah. Obviously, Midwestern literature started a little bit later, right, than literature from the East Coast. But Hamlin Garland would be would have been a good choice. But another white guy from a small town. So, other questions or thoughts?
Well, I was thinking similarly that the fixation on the 20th century doesn't just point to the fact that Midwestern literature is a little bit newer.
Mm-hmm.
It also, it seems to me, suggests that something happens at the birth of the 21st century that sort of fights or works against Midwesternism. And I don't know that it isn't like everybody getting cable. I don't know that there isn't, I mean, I'm just thinking about like ways, like the sequestering of with a television,
Yeah.
it seems to me starts to potentially erase difference or something. And I'm thinking about like the nature of the avant-garde. And at some point I have to ask a question. So I guess my question is, I mean, is there something inherently rural about them? I mean, because the Midwest has cities. So I'm trying to think about like
Midwest does have cities, and I should have said this, one of the ways I constructed the syllabus was to use works from small towns and rural works. I mean, I could have taught a whole course on Chicago literature. And so I guess because of that, I focused on small towns and rural areas, just because I felt I couldn't treat the cities in the course without, and then there's, of course, Minneapolis literature and But your earlier, was that a question about the television? Because television came up. I taught a David Foster Wallace essay, actually, about post 9/11 essay about being in, I think it was Bloomington, Illinois, just post 9/11, and just the, it was a critique of the sort of separation, lack of community, people, at home alone with their televisions while this news is happening, instead of where he felt, what he said in the essay was he felt like on the coast there wouldn't have been that kind of isolation. And of course, in the Kevin Young poem ends with this image of the Midwesterner isolated, alone, in her room with a television. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I actually grew up with parents who my family moved all over the U.S. and abroad, but my parents were always told us that they were from the Midwest and they were bringing us up with Midwest values. And so when I actually moved to the Midwest, I was quite puzzled about where the Midwest was that I had come home to in a way. But I'm wondering if, that aside, I always think of the Midwest in terms of also of images. And I'm wondering if you were to did you use any paintings or art as a way of also having the students think about landscape or?
I sure would like to have. And part of the classes, we start every class where students, my invitation was that students could bring in a piece of art. It could be a visual art, could be music, could be poetry, could be short prose, other Midwestern voices, because I was aware of that, my construction of the syllabus was excluding a lot of great art. And it hasn't tended to be that students have brought in visual art. I just think it's our English and some environmental studies students in the class are more comfortable with literature and poetry, but certainly the visual art component, when I was conceiving the class, I thought, yes, this is going to be part of it. Hasn't been so much. But you were also talking about Midwestern values, your parents wanting to raise you in Midwestern values. It's an interesting question because that's come up in the class too. Of course, students in the class, either those from the Midwest or those visiting from other places. I have a Hawaiian student, a Chinese student in the class, students from the coasts. What does it mean? What are the Midwestern qualities? And you don't really, I grew up in the Midwest, so I didn't really have a sense of what those were or what the stereotypes were until I went, and I was living in California at the time, and I remember going to my first faculty dinner party, and I stayed to do dishes, and my colleagues said, "Oh, you're so Midwestern," and I thought, well, I hadn't thought of that before. Yeah. So, but yes, there's been a lot of talk about Midwestern values or sort of openness or closedness of the Midwestern character. And that sort of isolation that Midwesterners sometimes feel. And one of the themes that comes up in all the books we've read is the sort of just the inability or the difficulty to communicate, especially Winesburg, Ohio, people living in small towns. Feeling things deeply, but not quite able to express themselves. Anything else? Thank you very much for coming. Take care.